midline and amplitude. Midline and amplitude.
What was that a notebook paper?
It's good. That's pretty common. Okay, here we go. So the first thing is let's go through what each one of these words is. First of all, I have graphed this equation up there. It's a sine graph. Okay, if you look back on the wall right there between Katie and Maddie's computers, you see cosine graph. They all look the same. Sine and cosine look pretty much the same. Remember that animation I showed you guys the other day? Right? They just look like waves. Okay? So sine and cosine just look like a wave. It's hard to tell the difference between the two. And actually, you could make a sine graph out of a cosine graph. Anyway, we'll talk about all that later. Now, what's the midline? Let's talk about that. The midline is, guess what? The middle. And it's the middle. Geez. It's the middle this way. It runs right through there. All right, now let me kind of send that to the back. Ooh, order. Here, let's do this. Nope. Undo that. And then make it transparent. Yeah, there it is. Ah, fancy. All right, so we can still see where that point is, right? 0, 3.5. That's the midline. Midline is exactly halfway in between here and here, right? All the way down to the bottom. It's symmetrical. Every cosine and sine graph is symmetrical that way. It's the same distance from the middle to the top as the middle to the bottom. It's the same distance. Okay, we can just see on the graph what the midline is here, right? It's 3.5. Now, let me do this. Let me blank that out. What if I didn't have that for you? And what if you couldn't see the graph numbers on here at all, but you knew that the height of this, notice how I'm looking at the y coordinates, the maximum height is 7.5 and the minimum is negative 0.5. How could you come up with 3.5? What could you do with those two? Find what's in the middle, find the median. Yeah, you're very close. How about this? Right? The midline equals the average of the maximum and the minimum. Now, what's an average? If you have 2 points, how do you find their averages? What do you have to do with them first? You add them up and you divide by 2, right? So that's what we're going to do. What was the maximum? You have it written down, right? 7.5. What was the minimum? So if we add up those two things, those two add up to 7. And if we divide that by 2, guess what that is? Okay, that's how you find the midline. You're just finding the average of the maximum and the minimum. Okay? That's one way to do that. Now, what if I asked you for something different? All right, so really quick. What if I told you what the midline was and I asked you for the amplitude? Amplitude is the distance from here to there. The amplitude is like the size of something, right? If you have an amplifier, it amplifies the sound, correct? It makes it larger. The amplitude is a distance. It's not a location. So if we say the amplitude is a distance, that means the amplitude can never be what kind of number? Can never be negative because it's a distance, right? Distances aren't negative, right? From here to Golden is the same distance as from Golden to here. It doesn't matter which direction it's coming from, right? So what is the amplitude? The amplitude is the height of this thing from the middle. So what is it in this case? It's 4, right? The amplitude is 4. It's always positive, right? It's always positive. How is it 4? Well, it went from 3.5 up to 7.5. Easy enough. You could also measure it to the bottom. Right? How far is it from 3.5 to negative 0.5? Yeah, I could just subtract them, right? 3.5 minus a negative. What happens when you subtract the negative, though? It becomes 4. So amplitude, I usually abbreviate just with amp or A, something like that. And the amplitude is the distance from the middle. Distance from the middle. The midline is the mid location. It's the average of the graph. Average all the way through. Okay, so on con, the questions will look like this. Here we go. Notice on all of these, did we pay attention at all to the x coordinates? No, we didn't at all. Come on. What's the midline equation of this function? That's just like saying, where is the midline? All right, so midline's somewhere in through here, right? It's hard to tell exactly where it is. What can we do when we have the maximum and the minimum? Good. 19 different ways to say find the average, right? So find the average of the two. What's halfway between them? We're looking at the y coordinates down there. So 1.25, add them up, divide by 2. If you add up the top, you get 8. What's 8 over 2? Does that appear to be about right? Yeah, that's a nice thing too. You can always just look at the graph. If you got 7 as an answer, that ain't right. Right, 7's way up here. Okay, let's do another one. They're going to give you different parts of the idea. All right, so they only give you one point here, and you're supposed to find the midline. But they also tell you up here what the amplitude is. Okay, so what's the amplitude tell us? It's a distance to the middle, to the midline. It's a distance to the midline. So what we can do is we can add the amplitude. Just so happens they're the same number this time, right? That's just coincidence. So if I add 1.5 onto that, I end up at exactly 3. Okay, so they'll kind of mess with you a little bit. This is the same as what we had before, right? Remember, we're just looking at the y coordinates. Now let's look at the amplitude assignment. All right, so amplitude is the distance to the middle. Distance to the middle. So I'm looking here, I'm looking at that and that. What is the distance to the middle? Remember, that's our amplitude, and it's always positive. So let's do this. Let's do negative 2.75. Let's subtract negative 6.25. If you ever do this in the opposite order, that's fine. Just make it positive. Doesn't really matter. What happens when you subtract the negative? You add it. So 6.25 and negative 2.75. It's not 4. Is it 4.5? This is 4.5?
3.5.
What is it, Warren?
3.5.
3.5 is correct, yeah. If this was 2.25, the answer would be 4. But we're actually subtracting more than that, right? Oh, yeah. Is it negative? No. Right, 3.5. There we go. Another one. What's the amplitude? Amplitude is the distance to the middle. It's also half of the entire distance. So here's another way to do amplitude. How far is it from there to there? So like if I went from bottom all the way up to top, minimum to maximum. Whoa. I did not mean to put divide there. My apologies. Right, that's 10.6. Now, if the whole distance is 10.6, then what's the distance to the middle? Good. So what we're really doing is we're cutting that thing in half, right? 5.3. Amplitude is distance to the middle. If you try to memorize all these little tiny formulas that Khan will spit up when you hit hint or help, you'll be lost, okay? You need to understand the concepts. Amplitude is half of this distance, right? It's actually the distance from there to there. So when I subtracted, I got 10.6 because that's the distance of the entire graph. Amplitude is half of that. Okay, let's do one more. What's the amplitude? Tell me now. 6.5 is correct. Because distance from there to here, right? 9.8 minus 3.3, 6.5. Okay, easy enough. Let's try these out.